Good afternoon, everyone. Are you able to hear me okay? Perfect. So my name is Dr. Ananda Marin, and today I'll be giving a presentation on Introduction to Qualitative Data Analysis. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time introducing myself, then give an overview of qualitative data analysis. We'll have a coding activity, then we'll continue unpacking what qualitative data analysis is. Okay, good. Okay. Then I'll provide some context for a second coding activity. We'll have that coding activity wrap up and have time for additional questions, but you should also feel free to ask me questions throughout if there's anything confusing or something you'd like to, for me to clarify. So, I'm from the Chicago area. I grew up in the Chicago area. These are some pictures from Chicago. And I moved to Los Angeles about a year and a half ago when I took the job at UCLA. I'm of mixed descent, and I identify as African American, Choctaw, and my mother is European American. I have a bachelor's degree in sociology, a master's degree in public policy, and my PhD is in learning sciences. It's an interdisciplinary field that brings together education, cognition, development, and computer sciences. When I finished my bachelor's degree, I spent time working at the Chicago Children's Museum in Chicago, in the community services department there. And then I went on to get my master's degree in public policy. I went back to Chicago, and I spent 8 years working at a community college there, Harry S. Truman College. It's one of the 7 city colleges of the city colleges of Chicago. It's in the uptown area, and I was in the student services department there. So my job was really to help students navigate through the community college process. That's okay. Good? Okay. Through the community college process and transfer on to 4-year universities. And then in my 8th year there, I was invited to participate in a project with the American Indian Center in Chicago. And that's when I decided to leave my position at Truman and return to graduate school and get my PhD. So some of the data that we'll be looking at for the activities comes from the work that I did at the American Indian Center of Chicago. So the qualitative research journey, as Dr. McCarty shared with you, I think a week or 2 ago, the qualitative research is a way of experiencing, inquiring, and examining, which focuses on describing the complexity of people's lives for the purposes of putting that acquired knowledge to use. Right? And as a qualitative researcher, you might use multiple methods, including participant observation, interviews, and documenting different activities. But really, qualitative research is about learning by doing, so being with others, experiencing things for yourself, and learning what is required to become a member of a particular community, right? And it also involves becoming skilled at asking questions, watching, feeling, remembering, describing, and writing. And more often than not, qualitative researchers engage in what we call cultural analysis. So trying to understand the beliefs, ideas, practices that people and communities are engaging in to accomplish goals. So as you participate in qualitative research and all of the activities that you do to collect data, you'll end up with various kinds of types of data, right? So interview transcripts, field notes, video, audio recordings, images, documents. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about data analysis, right? So we're analyzing these different kinds of data. It may be our own research journals, it may be pictures that we collect along the way, it might be interview transcripts. It could be, for instance, this children's drawing. It could be that we're looking at children's books, historical documents, whatever it is that will help us to answer our research questions. And ultimately, qualitative data analysis, right, is a way of bringing order to the piles or pieces of data that we're collecting. So it's about turning big piles of information into smaller piles or chunks, right, of summarized data, and continually moving from the whole to smaller pieces and back again. And ideally, it permits the discovery of patterns, themes, and the relationships between themes. So qualitative data analysis often happens simultaneously with data collection. It's a process that is recursive, so it's made up of smaller processes that is part of the whole process. It's a process that is dynamic and in motion, so it's always changing. We may start down one path and then learn that we need to veer off and go down another path. And it evolves and grows as our research questions change and as we become more intimate with the data that we've collected. So as Stake writes, there's no particular moment when data analysis begins. Analysis is giving meaning to first impressions as well as to final compilations. Analysis essentially means taking something apart. How is this part related to that part? And analysis goes on and on. Part of the trick is knowing when to stop data analysis, right? So we'll try our hand at some qualitative data analysis, remembering that this is about first impressions. And what I'm going to share is a video from an interaction with a community teacher and 3 youth. They're in Chicago in a park or forest preserve in the uptown area in Chicago. And I'll play this video clip and then just take a moment to kind of jot down your initial impressions and to think about what's going on.
This is going to be a cool map because it's not like a map like, oh, okay, we got to draw the road, we got to draw this. You can draw whatever you want on your map. So let's start by figuring out what are the biggest things that are around right now. Do you see any?
Starbucks.
Starbucks?
What?
Where?
Starbucks.
You can see a Starbucks?
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a Starbucks.
McDonald's, an iTunes store.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, show me where those are because I haven't seen them. Oh, they're in your head. Oh. Well, when you get telepathy and you can like project it into all of our minds, then we can draw it. But let's think about what's around us right now.
Starbucks.
Starbucks. Coffee.
Did you guys get the message? No.
Better luck next year.
I see GameStop. I do too.
So let's
It's by my house.
I think they're thinking of things they want to see.
I see birds.
birds,
I see blue sky.
blue sky, all these things
I see yellow birds.
we can put on our maps. But let's walk and see what we see, okay?
I see birds. What if I was blind, huh?
Well, then that would be
Make
tough.
it in front of me, huh?
Maybe you'd use other senses. What other senses do you think you could use if you didn't have sight? Make a map.
Blindness.
Okay. So just take a moment and on your own, jot down.
This is going to be a cool map.
Let's see, sorry. What you think is going on here, right? So if you had to provide a name in 3 to 5 words, what name would you use to capture what is going on between this adult and these 3 youth? If you need me to play the clip again, I can too. Yeah.
Well, he's kind of just teaching them about just like mapping locations, like physical location, specifically in this park. And that's pretty much it. And he's kind of, I guess he's trying to center them inside the park because their mind is on the corner.
It is on the corner. Other thoughts about what's going on? Yeah.
I see sort of like a pushback against the teacher, not like a overt one where they're like telling them.
They're definitely CPS
But
kids.
like they're joking around with them in a playful, anti-authoritarian.
Mm-hmm. Were you going to say something again?
I was gonna say they're definitely CPS kids.
Are you from Chicago? Yeah. So CPS is Chicago Public Schools. Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Rather than the kids focusing on their surroundings and nature, they were using their imagination that's mostly centered on consumerism. So I'd say he's trying to get them to concentrate.
Okay. And if you had to provide a name for this interaction, just 3 to 5 words, ideally 3 words, what would you name it?
They're learning how to do qualitative data.
Learning how to do qualitative. Okay,
Their learning is one word.
okay. Any other thoughts? It's hard to name what's going on, right?
It's just another day in the park.
In the park. So part of why I asked you this question is because what happens when we look at data and code data is that we name things, right? We end up giving a name to ascribe qualities to what is going on. And that name is what we use throughout all of our pieces of data to identify similar kinds of interactions. And this is just a glimpse kind of that process. So I will say, just let me back up for a moment. You see, the kind of analysis that we're able to do is dependent upon the quality of data that we have, right? So whether it's a survey, whether it's field observations, whether it's a video data, whether it's an interview, right? The kind of analysis and the depth of the analysis, right? Our ability to engage in meaning making is dependent on the quality of data that we have. So in this clip, what you can't see because of the way the video was taken is that there is a Starbucks on the corner, right? And the young lady is able to see that Starbucks, right? So the frame of the video constrains our ability as analysts to make meaning about what is going on, unless we're in that context with people for a long time, or we're asking other questions, or we're comparing across pieces of data. So just quickly, what else would you want to know about this place and these people in order to move forward with qualitative data analysis?
You maybe want to know what his objective is.
And how would you find that out?
You can kind of just listen to his language that he's using. He's kind of directing them. There's a certain type of guidance.
Are there other ways you might find out what his motive is? Yeah.
It was answering the question.
It's okay, go ahead.
Well, like, first of all, I want to find out if he's a teacher, and also like what school, and so on and so forth. Like, what is his actual real sense?
And how would you find that out?
I guess just like Google image search the guy's face. And see if there's like a Facebook or something. I don't know.
That's one way. Yeah, at the back.
Did you just interview him?
Yeah, you could just interview him, right?
Well, he's far away.
Well, imagine that this was your own research project, right? You might end up being the person behind the camera recording an interaction like this because you have questions about teaching and learning, and then 3 months later watch that video and say, oh, there's other things I need to know, right? Yeah.
I would also like to know why these particular kids, because they seem very small in number. So, like, is it just because that's the class size, which I doubt it, and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd also be curious as far as how long you've been working with the students.
And that might be interesting to know if we go back to your comment, right, about kind of how the kids are responding to him and their tone of voice and kind of their pushback on what he wants them to do and how he responds to that in kind. So all of this is part of qualitative data analysis, right? It's the process of looking at, thinking about, listening to, feeling, sensing pieces of information and trying to understand what's going on. And in that process, usually, ultimately, we develop new questions, right? And we might seek out other pieces of data. So let's unpack the qualitative data analysis process a little bit more. This is a quote from Miriam, right? And Miriam here is talking about the goal of data analysis, right? As being meaning making, or making meaning. And we do this by reducing, consolidating, and interpreting what people have said and what we have seen and read as a step in answering our research questions. All right, so what we were just doing now, right, is a kind of data analysis. It also involves interpretation, right, which is the step beyond analysis. So we're trying to attach meaning to relationships between data. So understanding what's happening in this video, for instance, and then if we also had an interview with the teacher, understanding who that teacher is, what is their background, why was he doing what he was doing, and then making sense of patterns across pieces of data. So, right? And this is ultimately to try to answer the question of what's going on here, or what is kind of the cultural practice in this community, or in this classroom, or in this setting. So as a beginning step in qualitative data analysis, there's usually 3 processes you could think about. So reading, reflecting, and connecting. And reading involves scanning the different types of data that you have, rereading them, or it could be reviewing them if it's video data, looking carefully at the details, and then engaging in what people talk about is pre-coding. So making kind of just marginal notes, your initial impressions of what's going on. And then the process of reflecting, so revisiting the aims of your study, your purpose, your objective, your goals, your research questions, thinking about what it is that you want to know, and then engaging in coding again. So taking those kind of initial pre-codes and developing some type of beginning coding scheme and looking at the coding scheme in light of your research questions. What am I talking about when I say coding scheme? Do you have a sense of what I mean? Yeah.
Do you mean like classifying kind of certain aspects of the research?
Exactly. So classifying, categorizing, giving a name to an interaction. Right? Other kind of understandings of what coding is, or the definition of coding?
Maybe like, so for example, if you do interviews or something, where you're like asking them about like specific actions and how they make them feel, that is like almost like coding or classifying data, that thing, or?
Yeah, so if you're interviewing, you're saying if you're interviewing somebody, asking them about how they're feeling?
Well, like doing like, remember I used to question that, like I'm doing a thing on like adjunct professors, and I was gonna ask them like when they felt included or excluded by their institution. Like, is that a form of coding already with that, or dichotomy, or?
Yeah, so people can approach analysis either from a deductive or an inductive method, right? If we're taking a deductive method, which is, I think, what you're talking about, you might take your research questions and develop codes from those questions. So if you're interested in how adjunct professors feel, and you have an interview protocol about that, you might go back and read your transcript and just take some initial kind of impressions about what's going on. And then you might go back, and what were the feelings that you had mentioned?
Like if they felt included or excluded.
Included or excluded. And then you might go back and mark any time the person is talking about feeling included and any time they're talking about feeling excluded. Right? And feeling included and feeling excluded would be your code.
When you asked us to come up with 3 to 5 words of the user, that was basically you asking us to form a code.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. Now the trick is, you might have questions about feeling included and excluded, but when you interview somebody, they might never use the term inclusion and exclusion. Right? So then you have to, as a researcher, come up with, from your kind of impressions of the data, what are the moments when this person is talking about feeling included, and how are they defining inclusion and exclusion locally in their own words, right? Because those are our terms as researchers, and oftentimes we'll have terms that come from the literature and other research that don't necessarily make their way into the kinds of data that we're collecting. So we have to do this back and forth between our interactions with people and what it is that we're learning from those interactions and what's in the research, right? And often it's a process of translation. Does that make sense? I see some head nodding. And then we would move on to connecting, right? Which is what we were just talking about. So categorizing and looking for connections among codes. And we can think about codes as names or labels right? For the phenomena that we're interested in. So it could be feeling included, it could be feeling excluded, it could be, the language that you used of anti-authoritarian, is that what you said? Yeah, right? It could be something like joking, so there was a lot of joking going on with the kids in the video, right? And as a researcher, I might go through and mark every time the kids are joking, right? And then if you could imagine if you have 40 hours of video data, let's just say in 15 hours of that video data, kids are joking. And I mark all of those moments. And then I want to look at those moments next to one another, right? And say, is there a pattern here? Why are they joking? When are they joking? What are they joking about? And then I might develop other codes to further describe joking and the importance of joking. Right, and this process, right, of going back and forth systematizes qualitative data analysis, right? So we're systematically looking at what was said, what we observed, right? And documenting how we're looking at data, how we're reading data, how we're viewing data along the way, either in a research journal or in notes or in what people talk about as analytic memos. Okay, so what is coding? We've been talking about this, but coding really is another way to talk about analysis. So it's cyclical, as I was just saying. It provides a system of filters. It organizes and groups our data. And often, the initial step in coding is called unitizing, or finding a unit of analysis. So it's the smallest piece of information about something that can stand by itself and is interpretable in the absence of any additional information besides a broad understanding of the context, right? So what I showed you in that video clip was a unit. Oftentimes when people are analyzing interview transcripts, for instance, a term, what people refer to as a turn of talk, will be a unit. So I say something, and you say something, and I say something, and that transcription of when I'm talking could be a unit, right? And you might apply all of your codes to those turns at talk. Or you might develop another kind of unit that is about the phenomena that you're interested in. Units can be, as much as a few words to a full page of text, depending on your research questions and the kind of data that you have. So, Saldana has written kind of an overview book on qualitative data analysis. And in it, he provides a few type of coding strategies that many people often find useful when they're beginning qualitative analysis. So that's open coding, right? And it's similar to what we were doing in this conversation, kind of reading, reviewing your data, taking notes on the margins, and describing what's going on, giving some names to things. There's descriptive coding, where you're trying to develop codes and labels, categories that specifically describe interactions. There's process coding, and process coding is different from descriptive coding in that you're interested in how activity unfolds, right? So you might, if you're thinking about the video, look at the process of how that adult asks questions, right? So does he ask a broad question and then go to a narrow question and then re-ask a question? Or you might look at the process for question and response. Or you could look at the process, in my own work I look at the process of how adults and children coordinate attention. So is it that they're sharing gaze? Are they moving in synchrony with one another? What is it that gets them to focus jointly on a phenomenon together? There's in vivo coding. So in vivo coding is similar to open coding. And here you're also using the words of those that you're doing research with to describe what's going on in the documents that you're reviewing. there's versus coding. So what do we mean by versus?
Against?
Against? Other understandings of versus?
Are you comparing two things?
So you might review as just an initial step if you're kind of stumped about what to do in your data analysis. Look at moments when people are comparing things, right? Oftentimes we use comparisons to make points about our ideas. And it's not that people will say this versus that, but they're setting up a comparison between two things, right? You could go through and code for emotions, so when people are talking about sadness, anger, or when it's your understanding that people are feeling certain emotions, right? That are expressed in their talk or their behavior, their nonverbal behavior. So all of these are just some, basic beginning steps that you might take in terms of coding, and there's other strategies as well. Any questions or thoughts about these kinds of coding strategies? Yeah.
If you as a researcher you know your own codes, right? But how do you communicate that to someone else that maybe just looks at or reads your research? Would you have like a legend or not a legend, but would you have a glossary or something?
Yeah, so there's different strategies for organizing your process for sorting and retrieving your codes, right? So one way to do this would be what people talk about as a code book, which is similar to an index or a legend. And you would list out your codes and the definitions of your codes, and you might provide some examples of instances that you applied that code to. You could use software programs, so there's lots of software programs that are out right now. In Vivo, MaxQDA, Deduce. Deduce is an online program that you pay for monthly, and all of these programs allow you to upload either video or transcript data, photos, different files, and then you would create your codes in that program and tag the pieces of data. And then you can always export. The nice thing about software programs is that you can export your code book, and you can also export summary files, so you can export any instances of a particular code, right? The drawback with software programs is that sometimes they can be overwhelming. And while software programs help with coding, they don't help us with interpretation, right? So remember, analysis is just one part of the process. And software programs are a great way to engage in analysis, but then you still have to go through and look for patterns between codes and make meaning between different instances, right? And sometimes that, for me, at least in my experience, has meant printing things off and rereading them and looking at them on paper. Other people use index cards. Sometimes people code entirely by hand, and they'll use file folders. So one of my collaborators, when she's an ethnographer, and she transcribes all of the interviews, she prints them out, she reads them again, and then highlights things that she finds interesting. She goes back to read it again, looks at those things that she's highlighted, provides labels or names for them, and then anything that has the same label, she'll cut out, and she'll put it in a file folder with that label. And she'll do that for each label that she's applied. And then that becomes, each file for her becomes the data set. And then what she'll do is go back and then read those files to get a sense of what the fullness of what that label or category means. And then she does another step where she goes back to the entire document again and rereads it. Right, so it's this process of reducing to going back to the whole, and reducing to going back to the whole. Because anytime you reduce data by labeling or coding it, we lose some of the context. Right, and we're trying to place things back in context. So it's this reiterative and cyclical process. Any questions so far? No? Okay. So I have another example for us to work with. Yeah, that's a cute picture. Right. Trying to find it. Coding is looking for this distinctions in the inequalities or kinds of things. And I have another example for us to work with, but before I do that, I'm going to share some background and context about where the data is coming from. Okay. So I was involved in a project called Living in Relationships that took place in Chicago from 2005 through about 2013. It was a multi-year collaborative project between the Menominee Language and Culture Commission, so the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, the American Indian Center of Chicago, Northwestern University, and University of Washington. It was a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation, and the focus of the project was cultural epistemologies and science-related practices. So why focus on science education for us, right? So the argument that we would make is that the place of science and science education in nations across the globe is ever increasingly a focus and a hope for solving some of the most pressing challenges that we're facing on the earth, right? So if we think about, even if we think about California as a context, right, we can ask questions about what does it mean for the shifts in the coastline, right, in terms of planning 10, 15, 30, 50 years into the future, and for future generations, what does that mean in terms of kind of health and well-being, both of us as humans, but for other plants, animals, right? And we would say that the country as a whole, right, is currently undergoing a process of reconceptualizing what science education is or could be, right? And this is evident in NGSS, so Next Generation Science Standards. And there's an ever-present focus on science literacy. We also know that in indigenous communities, the high school graduation rate for Native students is 51%. We know that very few Native students go on to get degrees in STEM-related fields. So there were 14 degrees awarded in computer science, 10 in physics, 5 in astronomy, and 3 in ocean sciences, and 1 in atmospheric science. Right? This is coming from the National Science Foundation in 2007. Right? And so for us, this was not just an issue of representation or opportunity gaps or achievement gaps, but it was fundamentally an issue of survivance and of sovereignty for indigenous peoples. And so from a socio-historic perspective, we could say that achievement issues emerge and reflect, right, the historical functions of formal education with respect to indigenous communities, right, that are related to white supremacy, assimilation, and the destruction of indigenous communities. And so a key piece of that history in the context of the United States and in Canada and in other countries has been the removal of educational decision-making from communities. All right. And so instead of focusing on research that looks at or documents the achievement gap, we were focused on research about epistemology. So epistemology, does anybody know what epistemology is before I read?
No.
I think the simplest way of talking about epistemology is a way of knowing, right? It's a study of knowledge. Meyer, who's a native Hawaiian scholar, would say that epistemology is a study of knowledge as a starting point for any discussion of indigenous education, right? So it's also a discussion of the priorities and need for identity, understanding what Native peoples believe about their knowledge origins, priorities, context, and exchange, teaches us more about its continuity, or the continuity of knowledge, right? So knowing something then is a cultural experience that strengthens or fractures culture. And in the context of the United States, right, schools are where we go to learn and to know and to find out about things. Schools are also places, right, that for many youth from non-dominant communities are experienced in ways that people use the term, I think, in research as epistemic violence, right? Where young kids are told that their ways of knowing, their ways of being are not legitimate in the school space, formal school space. And so what we were after was how do we create learning spaces that strengthen cultural experiences for Native American kids in Chicago? We know that most of them are attending Chicago public schools, and we know that for many of them, they're the only Native student in their classroom and probably in their school, right? And so these are some pictures of people that I've worked with in Chicago. But what we were after from a research perspective was something called nature-culture relations and learning, right? So as it's related to science education. So you can talk about nature-culture relations as a pivotal area that spans both science education and research on human learning and development. And by nature-culture relations, we really mean how humans think about and see themselves in relation to the natural world. So in relation to land, water, and more than human relatives in life, right? So do you see yourself as a part of the natural world, or do you see yourself as a part from the natural world? And that distinction of part of or part from the natural world, right, is implicitly embedded in most science education in public schools. And so we played around with this idea of apart from or a part of the natural world and designing science learning environments. So we've taken a multi-level approach to research on learning. And like I said, it was a 13, 15-year project. And we engaged in 3 kinds of research, right? So foundational studies on cognition or how people learn, studies of everyday practice, and something that's called design research. Is anybody familiar with design research? No? So design research is how we got the video that I shared. And design-based research goes by many names, right? Design experiments, formative intervention, social design experiments. It emerges from an engineering tradition, but it has roots in anthropology, cognitive science, developmental science, cultural psychology. The aim really is to develop theory and practice. It's about praxis, right? And to develop insights that can allow you to innovate learning environments. So it involves iterative stages where you theorize something, you design and you develop it, you enact it, you analyze it, and then you repeat, right? So the video that you saw is a lesson that was developed by community members at the American Indian Center of Chicago. The adult male in that video designed that lesson, right? He was trying to get after how do I help kids see themselves as a part of the natural world. He enacted it, we videotaped it, we watched the video, we reflected on that video, and then we went back and we redesigned, right? And then we would video again, we would watch that video of the enactment, and we would redesign, right? Always trying to move the learning environments in ways that reach towards equity. So design-based research often asks how can questions, right? So the overarching question for us was how can science education in indigenous communities both effectively teach Western and indigenous science? Right? And we did that through this design-based research process. And ultimately, you can think about design as a sequence of decisions that are made to balance goals and constraints. And these are decisions about how the design process will proceed, what needs and opportunities the design will address, and what form the resulting design will take. So a group of us, community members, elders, adults, youth, kids in Chicago would routinely sit around a table, design lessons like the one that you saw, implement them, and like I said, review them and re-implement. And some key questions for us was how can science education in indigenous communities both effectively teach Western and indigenous science? How do relational epistemologies impact learning and teaching? And then we had a variety of other questions. Ultimately, what we ended up designing was a program called Urban Explorers. That was a place-based outdoor science program for Native youth and families. It was intergenerational in the last several years, and so you can see You know, there was babies to elders there. And through that process, we developed a number of design principles for Native science education, and I won't read all of these. One of the principles was that nature is not an externality or apart from humans, but rather nature is a part, humans are a part of nature. So this is something we were always reaching towards in our interactions with kids, right, in multiple ways. So I'm going to share some other data. It's also from an enactment of a science lesson. And as we read through this, you should think about the kinds of language that these community teachers are using to convey relational epistemologies. And by relational epistemologies, I mean, how is it that teachers are talking about ways of knowing or understanding the natural world that positions humans as a part of the natural world, right, as related to the natural world. So I have, I think, 4 turns of transcript data. And this is data that's coming from video that was watched and transcribed. And there's 3 speakers, Max, Anna, and Tyler. Somebody volunteered to be Max? At the back of the room, yeah, with the red hat. And then Anna? Somebody volunteered to be Anna? Go ahead. And then Tyler, with the, you have UCLA?
Yeah.
Sweatshirt on? UCLA. Okay, so let's start with Max.
Okay, so some of these different organisms, they can't live in food areas, and they're not water out here. Chances are this water is a little bit more polluted. So one of the reasons that this is important is that we've harvested medicine from this place, right? And this river feeds the plants and animal life that's here. So we want to make sure that we're harvesting medicine when it's ready to be harvested. So in addition to finding out just basic health indicators, we also want to know the health of the system here. Did you want to say something, Brian? Alright, so Anna is right on. Plants that we use to heal ourselves are going to heal the earth before they're ready for us. So if we find out that this place is unhealthy, they're not going to want to use the plants here because they're not ready to be used for us. They still have to work on the earth first.
Sarah, hold up that shell. It's a freshwater clam. Of all the indicators of a healthy water system, if the clams can reach maturity, they get about that big. Then this water is clean enough. It doesn't have enough pollutants that the clams can't survive.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just back up and say, oftentimes the practice that people engage in for analysis is reading transcript data out loud, or watching video and then rereading it and rewatching it. So what I would like people to do on their own is to take 2 to 3 minutes to read and reread the transcript, and I'll put it back up so you can see all 4 turns together, and to develop some initial codes about what's going on here. And you could think about either descriptive codes or open codes, process codes, emotion versus in vivo codes. And then we'll come back together. And then I'd like you to share with the person sitting next to you the codes that you've developed. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to put this back up so that you can see all of the terms. And give you about 3 minutes. I'll let you know when the 3 minutes have passed. And then just turn to the person sitting next to you and discuss the codes that you've developed. Okay, so let's come back together. Is there anyone that's willing to share some of the codes that they came up with? UCLA.
So I kind of, from this whole, whatchamacallit, I basically deduced that this is like a learning environment. So for my coding, I just categorized different parts of the quotes into either explaining, theory/deductions, and action detail. And so for explaining some of the quotes are like, these different organisms, they can't live in polluted areas. And Anna says this river feeds the plant and animal life that's here. From Tyler, it's a freshwater clam. They can reach maturity, they can get about that big. And then for theory deductions, there's chances are this water is a little bit more polluted. Where was it? Sorry.
It's okay.
If we find out that this place is unhealthy, we're not going to want to use the plants here. And then some action detail is like, we've harvested medicine from this place, right? And they want to know the health of the system. So that's how I categorize those different parts.
So almost like a process coding, isn't it? Processes for explaining, theorizing, producing. And who was your partner? And did you have similar codes?
I just told her that instead of coming up with answers, they just come up with solutions. Like we needed to see that they were really considering what was not common and what they were talking about.
And did you change your codes at all after talking to one another?
Add it all in.
I just said,
Okay. And then behind you in the,
Oh, yeah, that's right. I tried to do more descriptive coding, or we just described what's going on. So I classified it into three main sort of buckets: lecture, like encouragement, and advising.
okay.
Where the lectures, like when they're being very descriptive about what they're talking about, so like at the beginning of Anna's whole thing, she's just explaining the process of the river and plants. The Tyler, when he's talking about the indications of a healthy water system, that kind of stuff. I saw encouragement with the question, "Do you want to say something, Ryan?" I was like, then I see that as a you trying to sort of get someone to respond, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Also, when Tyler told Sarah to hold up the shelf, that was sort of an example for the class, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then advising, so it's extrapolating is when they talk about when they move from description and then talk about the implications of the description. So, like, again, back to the freshwater plan, like, it talks about the size of the population, indicating the health of the system, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in both cases, it sounds like you created a kind of initial frame of what you were seeing and what you thought the interaction was, and then you developed some codes. Does anybody else want to share? Yeah.
I saw verses where whenever they would say, like specifically for Tyler, when he says of all the indicators of a healthy water system, I know that he is going to begin comparing something. And, you know, also too, of these different organisms by Max, there's lots of comparisons, right? They're trying to define what makes a healthy environment, what doesn't. And, yeah.
Anyone else would like to share? Somebody from this side of the room? Yeah.
I did more of these like descriptions for each paragraph. The first one, the max, I just put like scientific prediction. This is predicting based off of wisdom. The second one, Bradna, is more just three different ones. Bradna, we lie, perfect timing, thorough assessment. Yeah. The third one, I just perfect timing, thorough assessment.
So what's interesting is the differences in all of your coding schemes, right? And I'll say that as a practice, as a research team, we would read pieces of data together, and we all have kind of different perceptions of what was going on. Some of them were linked to different research questions, but some of them ultimately became real kind of debates back and forth about, okay, what is really going on and how can we understand what's happening inside the heads of people when we're not there, right? So just to give you a little context, this interaction happened outdoors in Forest Preserve Nature Park in Chicago. We were standing alongside the river. There were 4 of us that were co-teaching together, and there were about 15 kids with us. So I'm actually Anna, right? And then these are my 3 male co-teachers. And so when I look at this and when I code it, what I see is that partly I'm trying to intervene in how Max is setting up the activity, right? That he's setting up the activity purely from this kind of, I think, Western science point of view, right? Like, what is the, what organisms are in the water, what is polluted, what's not polluted, and right, we've been in these design meetings together, these conversations with one another, and had multiple discussions about relational epistemologies, this term that I was talking about before, and trying to create learning environments where we center being a part of the natural world, right? So that's me as Anna intervening and saying like, okay, this is good, but remember, right, that we're also here because we're interested in harvesting medicines. And when I say harvesting medicines, I mean harvesting different plants that have medicinal properties, right? And that the plants that are growing in this forest preserve are fed by the river. And so we also need to think about that framing, harvesting medicines, for the activity that we're about to do. And the activity was asking kids to go wade out into the river to collect samples and to test for, to test the health of the water, right? So there's different ways that you can read these interactions. You could read it as an interaction about power dynamics between male and female teachers, right? You could read about who gets the most time to talk, who has the most floor space in this discussion. You could think about the explanation process. You can think about all of these things. It's really dependent upon your research question. And you can have multiple research questions. You can have multiple interpretations, right? You could write multiple kinds of papers about this one piece of data. So Max, the teacher that's saying, okay, so some of these different organisms that can't live in the polluted areas, is the same teacher that we viewed in the video, right? And that video, I think, was one of the first summers that we had implemented the Urban Explorers program, and this is probably 2 years later, right? So we had tried to move from a model of a single teacher with kids to a group of us with kids. Right, and over time, we've collected all of this video data and we've kind of looked at the evolution of that process. Not something that you can really do on your own. Okay, so the other question I have is, knowing that now, right, what connections, if at all, do you see between the first piece of data, the video data, and the second piece of data? And based on those connections, if there are any, are there new codes that you would add to your coding scheme? Any thoughts? Anything coming to mind? Yeah.
The feeling of the response to the instructors, is it more positive, negative, is it angry, is it confused, is it concerned? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess that you could code it between the one teacher max versus 4 teachers, and kind of like, and then measure it by how far ahead they get along in the topic. So
Yeah.
maybe the first teacher had more resistance versus having 4 teachers.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
The approach Max see the brain change over time. There's usually more authoritative, and even within his original, like the authoritative things seem to disappear more and become more experiential in the way he approaches learning.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm raising this, right, to kind of point out the types of analysis that we can do depend on the data that we have. And you as the researcher are the tool, and you're constructing your data set. You're deciding when you have enough data, what is included in that full data set, what kinds of data give you enough comparison points, right, to make meaning about what's happening, what is the phenomena that you're interested in. You don't necessarily have to compare data across a 5-year span, right? But if we really want to understand the cultural practices of a community, what's happening, right, a phenomena, it involves some sustained long-term engagement, right, and looking at information over time. And our research questions will naturally expand or become more constrained based upon the data that we have, as well as the kind of coding that we can do. So I'm just going to end with some key questions that you might keep asking as you analyze your data. So from the universe of behaviors, activities, events, persons, and material conditions, why did you select what you did to code or to analyze, right? You should always be thinking about why is it that you're selecting that piece of information, this transcript versus another transcript. Why are you focusing on this person versus another person? What background information, assumptions, and experiences informed your decisions and the ways that you developed your codes and approached analysis? And what other interpretations of data are possible, right? There's always many, many, many interpretations of data. And usually in the process of research and writing, we end up writing about one possible interpretation. So I'll end there and open it up for questions, and you should feel free to ask me about qualitative data analysis or any other kind of questions that you have for me personally or about qualitative research. Yeah, go ahead.
This might become a dumb question, but have you found that a lot of qualitative research is kind of like statistic-based analysis of that in the form of math?
Can you repeat the last part? So have I found that a lot of qualitative research?
It's like the data that you're analyzing is kind of mostly based in statistics, like numbers specifically, or is it more about like the research itself?
So is the qualitative analysis more based in numbers, or is it more about the research itself? So let me make sure that I understand your question. So are you asking about the process of quantifying qualitative data, or about the content of what you're researching?
The process of quantifying qualitative data.
Yeah. So there's a lot of debate in the field about this, right? The one colleague that I was mentioning that prints out all of her transcripts and highlights them and then cuts them up, puts them in folders, she would never quantify qualitative data. And in fact, I don't think she would even necessarily create kind of a very structured coding scheme so that you could count how many times a code was applied. Right? She's looking for themes in data, and she would say that, here's the word again, epistemologically, right? From a qualitative way of knowing, right, from an anthropological tradition, that it's not necessary to quantify data. In the education world, and particularly education scholars that are more in ed psych, there is a tradition of quantifying qualitative data. And people will often engage in what we call content analysis. And so the transcript that we looked at, for instance, right, you can take an approach that's content analysis, you can take an approach that's discourse analysis. If you're taking a discourse analysis approach or even a critical discourse analysis approach, you're interested in how people are using language. And you'll end up writing a story about how people are using language. From a content analysis approach, you might look at the number of times somebody's explaining something, for instance, and then count those explanations and say something like, in a teaching event with 150 turns of talk, 10 of those turns included explanations, right? And some people find that useful, others do not. I think it depends on what your goal and your purpose is. Right? So it can become really important, for instance, if you are interested in, for thinking about a science classroom, for instance. How much opportunity is an instructor or a teacher giving to kids to create explanations, right? Because explanation is an important part of science. Then you might want to count the number of explanations that are crafted per child in an hour of instruction or something like that. But again, it goes back to research questions and what it is that you're trying to do in your particular study. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very.
Okay. Yes?
I find your research interesting. You're trying to get the children to connect to the land and like respect and treat that sacred, the land and the river. Did you guys find like towards the end of, like, is the research still ongoing or did it end already?
So you're asking if the research is still ongoing? So that, like I said, it was about a 10, 13-year project, and there are pieces of programming that are still ongoing that are not, no longer a part of the research project, right? So people still meet monthly on the weekends to run what they call science days, but it's not being recorded in the same way. Those interactions aren't being analyzed.
Do you guys find like the children have like a better identity because they have connections with the land or?
So did we find that children had a better identity because of connections with the land? I would say that that is a broad finding that we had, right? That we created a space for youth to express their Native identities, to learn about their own Native culture, and I would say that it empowered the youth that participated in the program. And what was interesting, I think, about this research project is that it truly was intergenerational. So yes, there were youth that participated in programming, but there were also community college students and college students that were research assistants in the project. And there were community elders that were teachers and were community designers and were also research assistants. And so that, I think, intergenerational scope is part of the reason why we can say that it impacted children's identity. Yes?
From what I understand about epistemology, it's more like basically tailoring modern knowledge to a particular group's tailored to their group so that they can better understand it or connect to it. Then how would you, as an outsider from who's not connected to that culture whatsoever, how would you be able to learn the way that is learn the way to teach that culture the way that they should understand it if you were never part of the culture or stuff like that? Like, is there a specific time frame you're supposed to be with that culture, or yeah?
So you're asking how you would learn kind of the epistemological orientations of a culture if you're not from that culture, and what does that mean in a teaching context if you're asked to be the teacher?
Yeah.
So, this is a question that comes up in education research a lot, and particularly in teacher education research. My colleagues and colleagues that I work with talk about, they would use the term epistemological heterogeneity. Basically what they're saying is that there's a diversity in ways of knowing, right? And they would also caution us, so I'm thinking of scholars like Chris Gutierrez and Barbara Rogoff, to not become trapped by what we talk about as the box problem, right? So that, if you are Mexican American, that means that you eat tortillas and you eat beans and rice. And if you are African American, that means that you eat collard greens and you listen to soul music and you do these particular kinds of activities. But to rather recognize that as humans, we're diverse beings and we participate in multiple cultural practices in multiple cultural communities, and we're always going between those cultural communities, right? So I think that's kind of a basic premise that some scholars operate from. And then in terms of learning and knowing, it's about developing relationships, right, and sustained relationships. Now, I think often what we hear is that, like, as a teacher in a classroom with 30 kids from different countries who speak different languages, how do I do this? And part of what we, I think, have talked about in our own work is stepping back and saying, okay, so as a teacher, what does it mean, or how do you learn to see the intellectual strengths of all children? And so it's not necessarily about learning all of the cultural practices, but how do we see kids, right? And how do we hear the intent in what they're saying? So from a research perspective, what we often do is engage in this kind of video analysis, sometimes with teachers, right? Where teachers will look at videos of their own classrooms and think about what's going on in that particular moment. Because as a teacher, it's really hard, right? Things are moving very quickly to sometimes in the moment process what students are saying. So we've worked to give teachers spaces to think about what's happening in their classrooms and then to go back and redesign or re-implement lessons. And that's why we've used the design-based research approach. So, yeah. Other questions?
You mentioned open coding and review coding and how they're similar. How are they different?
I think open coding is really kind of a first pass at coding, and in vivo coding, right? Partly, I think that the difference is being aware of your own kind of positionality in the coding process, right? So as researchers, we're always bringing our own frameworks to the data that we're looking at. And some researchers take the stance that this is what I do as a researcher. I bring my own frame and I interpret and I make meaning of the data. Other researchers take the stance that it's my job as a researcher to try to understand to the best of my ability how that individual or person is making meaning. Right, so with in vivo coding, I think that you're trying to use things like the participants' words to name things, but they're very similar. And at the end of the day, I don't know that it, I don't know that the terms that we use for the kinds of coding we do matters as much as being able to describe our process. Right, so you don't have to say that I engage in emotions coding, but you need to be able to say that, I have these documents, these data sources, this is how I approach them, this is what I did, this is my coding scheme and the kinds of codes that I have, and this is why I chose these codes. Right, it's much more important to document your own thinking and what you're doing than to be able to say, like, I used versus, or I used emotion, or I used in vivo coding. Really, those are strategies to help you get into the coding process, because it's, I think a lot of people that have many, many years of experience will say that you spend a lot of time in the field, you collect a lot of data, and then you read it and you view it, and you're like, what do I do now? Right, and that's not an uncommon feeling, and so these are really strategies when you're at that point to say, like, how do you get into the data and start doing something, right? And then keep going on that path. Yes.
This is more of a personal question. At the beginning, you mentioned that you had your PhD in learning sciences. That sounds super interesting. So I just wanted to try to understand what that was and in relation to like other comparable like PhD programs.
Yeah. So you're asking what is learning sciences? So learning sciences is a new field. You know, I think it is really coming, being, you know, built in the 70s, 80s, and it was cognitive scientists, computer scientists, engineers, designers that were coming together and asking questions about how do people learn, right? And in the program where I received my PhD, so I received my PhD from Northwestern in Evanston, Illinois, our program really focused on, you know, 3 major strands, so social context, cognition, and development. I think they renamed the strand, it's not the same, right? But ultimately, I think, you know, people are concerned with this question of not only what's going on inside the head when we're learning. So some people develop elaborate models about, you know, like how is it that people think about gravitational pull. Like there are people that make their careers like, you know, investigating that question. But also, what are the contexts that we need to create in order for people to feel competent as they're learning, right? Or what is the relationship between identity and learning? Those are all kinds of questions that learning scientists might ask. It's a very interdisciplinary field. There's not too many learning sciences programs. So Northwestern has a program, University of Washington, Vanderbilt, I think New York University, Stanford, you know, there are some others, but it's a smaller kind of community within education sciences, cognitive sciences.